I just got a call during that last song. I wasn't going to do this, and I'm only going to take one more minute to do it, but I just got a phone call. By the way, the phone number here is 874-5676, 1-800-895-5676. That's 874-KOPN or 1-800-895-KOPN. A gentleman just called me and basically told me that all the stuff that I just relayed to you was all well and good, but it was all historical and old, and we're much better than that now, and we would never, it's just a different day now, and that all that stuff's in the far past, and I should just forget about it. So I wasn't going to do this, but I'm going to continue just real fast with where I left off just a minute ago. 1981, first cases of AIDS are confirmed in homosexual men in New York, Los Angeles, San Francisco, triggering speculation that AIDS may have been introduced via hepatitis B vaccine. 1985, according to the journal Science, HTLV and VISNA, a fatal sheep virus, are very similar, indicating a close taxonomic and evolutionary relationship. 1986, according to the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, from their volume 83-4007-4011, HIV and VISNA are highly similar and share all structural elements except for a small segment, which is nearly identical to HTLV. This leads to speculation that HTLV and VISNA may have been linked to produce a new retrovirus to which no natural immunity exists. 1986, a report to Congress reveals that U.S. government's current generation of biological agents includes modified viruses, naturally occurring toxins, and agents that have been altered through genetic engineering to change immunological character and prevent treatment by all existing vaccines. That's 1986. Are we getting close enough for you, sir? How about 1987? Department of Defense admits that despite a treaty banning research and development of biological agents, it continues to operate research facilities in that exact technology at 127 facilities and universities around the nation. 1990, more than 1,500 6-month-old black and Hispanic babies in Los Angeles are given an experimental measles vaccine that had never been licensed for use in the United States of America. The CDC later admits that parents were never informed that the vaccine given to their children was experimental. 1994, with a technique called gene tracking, Dr. Gary Nicholson at the Marilyn Anderson Cancer Center in Houston, the MD Anderson Cancer Center in Houston, Texas, discovers that many returning Desert Storm veterans are infected with an altered strain of Mycoplasma incognitus, a microbe commonly used in the production of biological weapons. Incorporated into the structure of this particular strain is 40% of the HIV protein coat, all right? That indicates that it's man-made. 1994, Senator John D. Rockefeller, issues a report revealing that for at least 50 years, the DOD has used hundreds of thousands of military personnel in human experiments and for intentional exposure to dangerous substances. 1995, the U.S. government admits that it had offered Japanese war criminals and scientists who had performed human medical experiments salaries and immunity from prosecution in exchange for data on biological warfare research. 1996, Department of Defense admits Desert Storm soldiers were exposed to chemical agents. 1997, 88 members of Congress, which is pathetic that only 88 members of Congress care about this, and even they won't push it. They signed a letter, in any case, demanding an investigation into the use of bioweapons and the connection to Gulf War syndrome. All right, you're listening to Radio Orbit. I want to get right to this interview because we have only an hour and 50 minutes left of the show, and this interview is going to take up the lion's share of that amount of time. You're listening to Radio Orbit. This is Mike Hagan. The show, if this is the first time you're listening to this program, it's a very emotional show for me because it hits home, and it's very personal because some of these experiences have directly affected my life and people who I'm very close to's lives. The program is not usually as intense as it is tonight and was last week. Next week we're going to be talking about crop formations, and we'll lighten things up a little bit, and it should be actually a really interesting show. But tonight has to be done. We're talking about mind control and the documented evidence of research and funding into mind control and secret experimentation on human beings, United States citizens, over the last 50, 75, 100 years by agencies of the U.S. government. My guest is Dr. Colin Ross from the Ross Institute of Psychological Trauma. This is the interview that I taped with him a couple of weeks ago. You're very fortunate to be listening to it tonight. Dr. Colin Ross on Radio Orbit. Good evening and welcome back to Radio Orbit. As always, I'm your host, Mike Hagan, and tonight my guest is Dr. Colin Ross. Dr. Ross is the founder and director of the Ross Institute for Psychological Trauma. He is a medical doctor of psychiatry, and he is also the author of a book called Bluebird. And Bluebird is, in my opinion, the definitive work documenting the U.S. government's direct involvement in the funding of mind control experimentation and the creation of the so-called Manchurian candidate, and oftentimes on unwitting subjects. So Dr. Ross knows more about this subject than just about anybody I can think of, and it is my pleasure to welcome him to the program tonight. So Dr. Colin Ross, welcome to Radio Orbit.
Hi, thanks for having me on.
Hey, thanks very much for being here. In fact, that was my first order of business here, is to thank you. I know you're a very busy man, and I want to thank you for taking the time to share with me and my audience. But it's very important research what you've done, and I think it's great that you're going to share it with us tonight. So thanks a lot.
My pleasure.
Great. Okay. I'd like to start, I think, by doing a little bit of background on yourself. I'm fascinated by after reading much of your material, I'm fascinated as to what brought you to it, and sort of your pathway toward the research that you eventually did and that you continue to do. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about where you came from.
Well, it's kind of an accident and kind of a falling down the rabbit hole kind of thing. I went to medical school in Canada from 77 to 81. I was Canadian by birth and moved to Dallas in 91.
Okay.
And then I did my psychiatry training in Winnipeg from 1981 to 1985. And then I was a academic psychiatrist based in a medical school. Never heard a word about military mind control, never read about it, wasn't aware of it, wasn't thinking about it.
Mm-hmm.
And I moved down to Dallas about November 91. And I started consulting to and running a program for people with really traumatic, abusive childhoods.
Okay.
A fair number of whom had multiple personality disorder and other kind of related disorders, post-traumatic stress disorder. And within a couple of months, and that's my area of specialty that I've written books about and so on.
Right.
After a couple of months of being in Dallas, instead of domestic abuse, incest, some cult ritual abuse and so on type stories, I started to hear a different kind of story from the people I was working with.
Mm-hmm.
That was, when I was a kid, I was either taken to a hospital, taken to a military base, and there was all kinds of scientific equipment around,
mm-hmm.
people in lab coats, and they were spinning me around physically, giving hallucinogens, memorization exercises, sensory deprivation, hooking EEG leads up to the head, electric shock, wearing weird goggles that distorted things, all kinds of different drugs involved.
And
I started hearing all these stories. That's what got me into it.
Okay, and this is when you were in Dallas in what did you say, 1991?
Early 92.
Okay, early 92. And the stories you were hearing from some of these subjects, were they relating stories that were typically older? In other words, would it have placed them back a little bit further in history, or were they sort of current stories?
They were generally, this was 92, and they were talking mostly about in between 20 and 40 years previously.
Okay, so we're talking 40s, 50s, 60s, that sort of time range. Okay.
And then one day, with a sort of air of great paranoia and secrecy, one of the patients handed me this document and said, "Here, take this. I don't want it anymore. Do whatever you want with it."
Really?
And it was a declassified document that had been declassified in the 70s. There was a memo from, if I remember right, it was from J. Edgar Hoover to Richard Helms.
So it was a U.S. document.
CIA.
Okay.
Talking about MK Ultra.
Mm-hmm.
And this is the first time I really heard much about this.
Well, I tell you what, since some of my listeners may or may not be particularly familiar with MK Ultra, why don't you do a little quick framework for that too?
Okay. Well, let me just carry on with this, because what I decided right away was, okay, I'm going to look into this. I never heard any of this kind of stuff before. Sounds pretty unbelievable, but I'm going to look into it.
Okay.
And I kind of divided looking into it onto one track, and how to do treatment into a separate track. This wasn't really about how to do treatment. It was about how much of this is real and what's it all about and what's going on and what can I find out. And that's when I started looking into it, and I filed a bunch of Freedom of Information Act requests with the CIA, started reading books mostly from the late 70s, then going to the medical school library, and I found out about this whole gigantic mountain of facts and documents. And MKUltra is part of that. It's a CIA mind control program that was declassified in the mid-70s. And it ran from about 1963 to 1972, roughly.
So this is a documented program or operation by the Central Intelligence Agency of the U.S. government.
Yeah, and you can actually, now you can get all the documents on a CD-ROM. Unfortunately, when I got them, it was photocopies at 10 cents a page, 15,000 pages. Now it's like a $30 CD-ROM. But yeah, there's a whole series of these mind control programs that have been declassified since the either 75, 6, 7 in there somewhere.
Right.